Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our fourth IDI speaker series session. Today we're privileged to host Gregory Aftandilian, a distinguished expert on U.S. foreign policy and Middle Eastern affairs. Before we dive into our fourth IDI speaker series, I'd like to briefly introduce the International Diplomacy Initiative and our speaker series. So we'll go over a quick introduction, what our commitment is, the team that's putting these events together, our current chapters internationally, and then the IDI speaker series and upcoming events. Hold on. As the IDI, we are aiming to educate and empower the next generation of diplomats and international relation professionals, and we're committed to providing an immersive and practical learning experience. We were found not too long ago in 2020, and since then we have been able to acquire about 400 members. The values that we base all of our activities on and events is integrity, respect, inclusivity, excellence, and collaboration. And we strive for excellence in all aspects of our work, from educational content to organizational management. Our objectives as the International Diplomacy Initiative are global networking for all our members, practical exposure, cultural understanding, and innovation in diplomacy, which means that we're encouraging innovation in diplomatic practices by integrating modern technologies and new methodologies in our programs and collaborations. We're dedicated to building a global community of informed, skilled, and passionate individuals equipped to contribute for a more peaceful and cooperative world. And we do that by doing the international networking, by doing events like these where we're connecting people with similar interests and fostering conversation. Our team that is putting together these events is our president, Tal Zellinger, who's also joining us today. Myself, Kami, Lior, and Paula. Their efforts have been huge, and I'm really grateful for everything they're doing every day. And our current chapters are, so our founding chapter was in Israel at Reichman University in 2020. And then in the same year, we also established our partnership with the Junge Union in Germany, which was the founding of our first abroad chapter. Then in 2021, we established a chapter in Italy, and there are many more in progress, amongst them one in Ireland. We also have some joining us from the team there today. And then coming to our speaker series that you're currently being part of. It's an ongoing online event series initiated on December 7th, and we're trying to keep up a bi-weekly series by aiming to combat misinformation and fostering a comprehensive understanding of the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. Our goals is to educate students and others with limited access to in-depth knowledge and fostering dialogue to spread understanding through expert insights, and the importance is to promote informed discussion and a complex international issue, and to bridge knowledge gaps with expert-led sessions. I am very happy to welcome our today's expert, Gregory Aftandilian, who's an expert in U.S. foreign policy and Middle Eastern affairs and teaches at American University, as well as holds adjunct roles at Boston University and George Mason University. With over 20 years in US government service, including advisory positions for Congress and the Senate, he's a recognized authority on Middle Eastern politics, notably Egypt. Aftandilian, a respected author, has also been a research fellow at Harvard and the Council on Foreign Relations. His academic credentials include degrees from Dartmouth, University of Chicago, and LSE. Thank you so much for joining us, and please welcome with me Gregory Aftandilian.
Well, thank you very much, Lydia. It's a great honor to be here with all of you, and I think this international diplomacy initiative is a fantastic idea and organization because it brings young people together to discuss foreign affairs. And even though things are very politically charged these days, as we all know, it's important to actually delve into issues and speak honestly as much as one can about the controversial issues that we're going to address. Because if we can't do that in an intellectual open forum, then I think we're all in trouble. That's my point of view. So I've never been shy about addressing such issues in my classrooms. And I think we can all learn from each other. If some of you in the Q&A have some disagreements with my interpretation, that's fine. I'd like to hear from you, and we can have a nice dialogue as well. So that's my philosophical approach, if I could say a few words about that at the beginning. So essentially, I'm going to talk about how the Biden administration has tried to straddle the fence between its very pro-Israeli policies and its desires to maintain U.S. relations with the Arab world. I'm also going to say at the end of my talk a few comments about American domestic politics, because of course we're in 2024, which is a presidential election year, and I think there'll be some interest in discussing what is in store this coming November in terms of how the Israel-Hamas issue and the war in Gaza is playing domestically in the United States. So without further ado, let me sort of get into my talk and say a few words about the situation prior to October 7, and then talk about the events since October 7. So as many of you may know, prior to October 7, the Biden administration did not really have a peace process plan as many US administrations prior to Biden have had. I think Biden, he's been around the block, as they say. He has known Israeli politics and Arab politics for quite some time, just because he was chairman and leading Democrat of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for many years. He traveled to the Middle East a lot. I think early on in his administration, he sized up the situation and he said, well, it's really unlikely that any sort of direct Israeli-Palestinian peace process is going to get off the ground, because Netanyahu, who came into power again a few months after Biden came into power, essentially had probably the most right-wing Israeli government in its history, and some of the people in his cabinet never believed in a two-state solution. And Netanyahu's position on the two-state solution was ambiguous at best. And then he saw the Palestinian issue being divided between Hamas in Gaza as well as Fatah in the West Bank. So he decided then to actually follow through on a Trump initiative, which was the Abraham Accords. And despite Biden's criticism of Trump and many of his foreign policies, he actually embraced the Abraham Accords which were, to establish relations between the Arab states and Israel, and hopefully that would lead to some type of Arab-Israeli peace down the road, including dealing with the Palestinian issue. But the main emphasis was on trying to get more and more Arab states to have relations with Israel. The big prize, of course, was trying to get Saudi Arabia to have diplomatic relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia, a lot of U.S. diplomats and other officials, traveled there, despite Biden in his campaign in 2020 calling Saudi Arabia a pariah state. But nonetheless, the idea being that if Biden could get Saudi Arabia and Israel to have diplomatic relations, that would be a big win. And as we all know, only a few months after Biden became president, you had the Afghanistan debacle, where that really hurt Biden's foreign policy credentials. So I think he was hoping that the Saudis and the Israelis could come to some type of agreement. And that would be kind of a feather in his cap. The other interesting thing was that Biden also threw himself into Israeli domestic politics because Netanyahu and his cabinet, as many of you know, wanted to have this so-called judicial overhaul, which would then limit the independence of the Israeli judiciary. Biden sided with the liberal element of the Israeli society, as well as the liberal element of the American Jewish community, who saw Netanyahu's judicial overhaul plan as a bad thing, and Biden certainly sided with that liberal element. So his relations with Netanyahu were kind of fraught. Partly that was because of the judicial overhaul issue, but partly because of his history with Netanyahu. Some of you may know the story, but he apparently said several years ago something like to Netanyahu, "Bibi, I love you." That's the nickname for Netanyahu, but we disagree on almost everything in terms of issues. So that was the stage prior to October 7th. And then when the Hamas atrocities occur on October 7th, then things began to change, excuse me. And Biden gave very emotional addresses, not only in the White House lawn after the October 7th Hamas attacks, but also he went to Israel and he made some very emotional and pro-Israeli statements. Let me just quote you on some of the comments. This is by Michael Oren, who was a former Israeli ambassador to the US. He said, quote, "In the 50 years that I have been researching Israeli-US relations," he was also an academic, "and in many years in which I served in senior diplomatic posts that bring the two nations together, I do not remember a more pro-Israeli speech than that delivered by President Biden last night." And Biden described the Hamas attacks on Israel as, quote, "unadulterated evil, bloodthirsty brutality." And he even told Benjamin Netanyahu that if the United States faced such an attack, his own response would be, quote, "swift, decisive, and overwhelming." And so Biden, kind of invoked his own pro-Zionist sentiments after the October 7 attack, met with the relatives of the victims of that attack, spoke very emotionally in Israel, and sort of put his kind of pro-Zionist bona fides out there for all to see. And that was very well received by the Israeli community, as well as the larger Jewish diaspora. Biden also seemed to then meet with the Israeli war cabinet and essentially give Israel kind of the green light to go after Hamas. And so that was the sentiment right after the October 7 attacks in Israel by Hamas. Um, there was also, of course, a mending of the feelings between Biden and Netanyahu. He came to Israel, gave Netanyahu a big bear hug, and it seemed that Biden was putting his partisan view of Netanyahu on the sidelines and kind of addressing him as the leader of the Israeli people and to show that he was showing solidarity there. Um, the issue then becomes, of course, Israel then undertaking the air war against Hamas in Gaza, and then, of course, the ground invasion. And press reports started to mount that you had Palestinian casualties as a result of the bombing campaign, and you had increased anger within the Arab world, uh, not only against Israel but against the United States for supporting Israel in such a close embrace. And that caused some problems, I think, for U.S. diplomacy. Um, Even countries like Egypt and Jordan, where the United States has had close relations, started to object. And there's a quote in the press by the Egyptian president, Sisi, um, where he says, quote, that Israel's assaults in Gaza have exceeded, quote, the right of self-defense, unquote, and have turned into collective punishment, unquote. So these are comments by American friends in the Arab world, not enemies in the Arab world. So after a few weeks, you see that the Biden administration is now having to kind of recalibrate a bit because now its very close embrace of Israel in the wake of the October 7 attacks is having repercussions for U.S.-Arab relations. And not only the Palestinians, but also American friends in the Arab world have started to criticize this close U.S. embrace of Israel as the casualties started to mount. And many of you, of course, saw pictures of the Palestinians forcing to flee from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, hoping that they would be safe in southern Gaza. But then you saw more and more casualties, even among the Palestinians in southern Gaza, as Israel continued its bombing campaign. I always say that in the Middle East, history is always important. This is what I teach my students. So the October 7 attacks, one can say, reminded the Israeli Jews as well as the Jewish diaspora, say, of the pogroms in Tsarist Russia when Jews were targeted by, say, the Cossacks unleashed by the Tsarist government, and then later by the Holocaust of targeting Jews, rounding up Jews, killing Jews, taking Jews away. So that was a memory that came to the forefront on October 7. For the Palestinians, on the other hand, you can see the migration, forced migration, say from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, brought up all of these images of the Nakba, or in Arabic is called translated into English, is called the catastrophe of the 1948 experience, when many Palestinians either fled or were forced to flee from their homes in Palestine. So this is why this incident, I think, has become so inflamed, because it brought up all of these images from the past, and that is not easy to overcome on either side. Um, so anyway, as many of you know, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, traveled and has traveled a lot to the Middle East. When he has gone to the Arab countries, he's gotten an earful by the Arab officials about, Israel has to be restrained. There should not be this kind of unrestrained bombing campaigns. The Palestinian civilians are being the victims of Hamas and the Israeli bombing campaign, and they should not be the ones that are suffering. Something like two-thirds of the casualties, it seems apparent, in Gaza have been actually women and children, not the combatants. And it later came to life, later came to light, excuse me, that initially about 45% of the Israeli bombs that were unleashed on Gaza were so-called dumb bombs that caused much death and destruction. These are non-precision weapons that were used in the bombing campaign. So the United States, as I said, after this very close embrace of Israel in the wake of the atrocities by Hamas, now finds itself in a dilemma because now it is getting a lot of flack from the Arab world as well as other elements of the international community. Um, so we see then by November of 2023, Anthony Blinken is saying essentially that, and I'll quote, that there are far too many Palestinians have been killed. And then Biden in December of 2023 told a group of campaign supporters that the Israelis have used indiscriminate bombing in Gaza that is costing Israel support around the world. And then Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that the killing of civilians would lead Israel to have a tactical victory that could lead to a strategic defeat, basing on the fact that the US in both Iraq and Afghanistan were engaged in insurgencies, and whenever innocent civilians were killed, that made many more enemies down the road that the US had to deal with. So we see kind of a recalibration a bit by the Biden administration by late 2023 about the whole war and where it was going. Now, there was some outreach again to the Saudis. As some of you may know, the Saudis I think are very sensitive to their own domestic public opinion. They did not, of course, join the Abraham Accords, but it was always the big prize of the United States and Israel to have them join the Abraham Accords. But the Saudis essentially said there has to be some type of deal for us at the end of this war for us to come on board. And the deal would be some type of movement, at least, towards an independent Palestinian state that would come from the ashes of this war in Gaza. The Biden administration also spoke out about the need for the Palestinians to govern Gaza after the war, and the idea being that there should be a revitalized Palestinian Authority that would take over Gaza. However, some people have also said this perhaps is a bit unrealistic, considering that the Palestinian Authority may not want to come to Gaza. They were expelled in 2007 from Gaza, but they may not want to come back to Gaza on the tanks of the Israelis. There was also tensions between the U.S. and Israel over the post-war plan. Biden and his team have said there should be a two-state solution. This was not, very well received by Netanyahu and his government. And in fact, just recently, Netanyahu said publicly that there should be Israeli control over all the territory west of the Jordan River, which essentially means that he's precluding not only a Palestinian state, but in my mind, even Palestinian Authority in these areas. There was also an increase in settler violence in the West Bank, and some of that was encouraged by the National Security Minister, Ben-Gvir of Israel, who was seen as even handing out weapons to Israeli settlers. And so the Biden administration was critical of that. And Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has also even publicly distanced himself from Israel because Israel has held up Palestinian tax revenues that are supposed to go to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And Blinken said that money should actually be in Palestinian hands. So by late December of 2023, and now we're in January of 2024, we see increased tensions now between the US and Israeli governments over not only the current situation in Gaza, but post-war plans. I should also point out that the Biden administration has also defended Israel very vigorously at the UN and has blocked several attempts by the UN to call for a ceasefire. Even many of the European partners of the United States have spoken out about the need for a ceasefire. But the United States has kind of been an outlier on that issue. What has been done, of course, is that the US pushed for a so-called humanitarian pause a few months ago, which allowed negotiations to take place between Hamas, Qatar, and Egypt, and indirectly with Israel to allow for about 100 Israeli hostages to return to Israel. So that was considered a short-term success, but after that humanitarian pause, the fighting then resumed. There's also been some criticism by the Biden administration over the amount of humanitarian aid that the international community wants to get into Gaza. There's been criticism that Israel has been holding up some of this humanitarian aid in the belief that it would go to the Hamas fighters, not to ordinary Palestinians. But nonetheless, that has also been a bone of contention. You see then the United States, after this very close embrace of Israel, now kind of distancing itself from Israeli policies. I should also say that some people have suggested that the intense bombing campaign in the early stages of the war has receded a bit, and some people credit the Biden administration for putting some pressure on Israel for that type of holding back a bit. But even today, we still see bombing in the southern part of Gaza, where most of the Palestinians from northern Gaza have now been relocated to. So the war is ongoing, and the Biden administration is actually wanting the war to wrap up. Even though Biden himself embraced the idea that Hamas should be completely defeated in Gaza when he was speaking to the Israelis in October, it seems that that's now kind of a distant goal. I saw a press report today where the US intelligence community is saying that only about 30% at most of Gaza's Hamas militants have actually been killed or captured. So that leaves about 70% of them still at large. And, you know, there's now about 25,000 Palestinian deaths in Gaza, most of them civilians. So the question, from the US is trying to deal with at this point is, well, how long is this war going to go on? Because Hamas has not been defeated. And Netanyahu says the war is going to go on until Hamas is defeated. But the US intelligence community is saying that the war aims by the Israelis have really not been fulfilled in these subsequent months after October 7, which begs the question, how long will Netanyahu continue with the war? We see also pressure within Israeli society by the families of the hostage victims. They are putting pressure now on the Israeli government to say, the hostages should be the first priority, getting them released, not the prolongation of the war. And that's going to be a continuing battle within Israeli society, I think, for the coming few months. So what I'm trying to get at here is that not only do we see a kind of a recalibration a bit by the Biden administration about its kind of 100% pro-Israeli policy, but we see differences over what's coming over the next few months, as well as what's going to happen in a post-war situation. I think Netanyahu, in some respects, wants to protect his right flank. Of course, there are more right-wing members than he is in his own cabinet. These would be the National Security Advisor, Ben-Gvir, as well as the Finance Minister, Smotrich, who are very hardline. They've even suggested that there should be, quote unquote, voluntary Palestinian migration outside of Gaza or out of Gaza, which the US has condemned. So Netanyahu may be playing to that right-wing, extreme right-wing political base. But he also, I think, shrewdly understands that in an election year and in US Congress, Israel still has that political support. And even though Biden is privately critical of Netanyahu's policies at this point, Biden is not going to put punitive measures on Israel. And in fact, Biden is still supporting the idea of something like $10 to $14 billion in additional military aid to Israel going forward to help it in its war campaign. So as long as Netanyahu knows that Biden is not going to punish him for certain policies, and that the majority in Congress are going to support Israel at this point, Netanyahu, I think, believes that he can get away with openly defying Biden. And this is why Netanyahu publicly said that he is not going to be in support of a Palestinian control over Gaza in the near future, and he's against the two-state solution. And he says west of the Jordan River, there should not be Palestinian control over any territory. So he's able to get away with that because the majority in Congress supports him. In other words, almost all Republicans and then some Democrats, as well as knowing that Biden, especially in an election year, is not going to put the squeeze on him. So I think that's kind of the reality of the political situation vis-a-vis Israel and the United States at this point. However, I should also point out that younger and more progressive Democrats have been increasingly critical of Israeli policies as well as Biden's close embrace of Israel. There have been a number of polls taken, and let me just reference some of them, where, excuse me, 61% of Americans sympathize with the Israelis compared to 30% with the Palestinians. But a growing number, 38%, said Israeli military response to Hamas has been too much. And then there's been some polls, excuse me, that say that there's a generational difference between younger Democrats and older Democrats. Democrats ages 18 to 34 expressed disapproval of the United States sending weapons to Israel, in contrast to 59% of voters aged 35 to 49 saying that they approve it. And so there's a generational divide. For older Democrats, they saw Israel as kind of a besieged state growing up, surrounded by enemies. For younger Democrats, they've seen Israel as a very strong country in the Middle East, and see them as not giving the Palestinians their due rights. So there's a problem within the Democratic Party for Biden by his embrace of Israel. And then if we look towards the 2024 election, we come to some interesting things because, as we all know, in the 2020 election, Biden, squeaked by in a few states that are so-called swing states. In other words, they could either go Democrat or Republican. But in the state of Michigan, you have a lot of Arab Americans, something like almost 250,000. They threw their support behind Biden in 2020 because of Trump's kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric that he, exhibited during his campaign and his presidency. And so they supported Biden, but now they're very angry about Biden over the whole Gaza situation. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to throw their support behind Trump, but they could simply stay home and not vote for either candidate. And in some swing state elections, that could prove to be decisive. So the bottom line here is that Israel still retains control of the majority of Congress, and you still have probably that supplemental billions of aid going to Israel, but you have increasing criticism within Biden's own Democratic ranks about the situation going forward. And even some moderate Democrats in the Senate, they're a handful. They're not the majority, of course, but they're a handful. They have actually come out and said that the Biden approach of arms sales to Israel without any scrutiny by Congress is a wrong idea. In other words, Biden in December, just a month ago, approved a sale of about $147 million worth of arms to Israel, saying that because it's an emergency, quote unquote, they do not have to go through the normal congressional oversight process. So some Democrats have questioned Israeli military tactics in Gaza and have said that Israel should be treated as any other country, even though there's been a long-standing U.S.-Israeli relationship, and any future arms sales to Israel should have greater congressional scrutiny. So we see growing rumblings within the Democratic Party over the whole Gaza war and U.S. support for the Israeli military campaign there. But at the end of the day, my sense is that that supplemental aid is going to go through. Of course, some of you may have followed American politics. It's tied up with the Ukraine aid and the border security aid and the whole business. So it's a very complicated thing. But I think at the end of the day, that aid is going to go through. Um, However, as that supplemental aid goes through, again, I think the U.S. is still going to have more and more problems with its friends in the Arab world who see that U.S. is aiding and abetting a military campaign in Gaza that will cause more and more civilian casualties. Um, so I think on a foreign policy front, the Biden administration, in my mind at least, and you can agree or disagree with me, has kind of dug itself into a bit of a hole at this point. Um, Certainly, there was genuine sympathy for the Israelis after the brutal October 7 attacks. And Biden, I think, was reflecting his own genuine pro-Israeli sentiments by his close embrace of Israel. But the longer that this war in Gaza continues, I think it's much more problematic for the U.S. To hold on to its relations in the Arab world. So with that, I think I'll stop and I'll open up to questions. And if you agree or disagree with me, that's fine. This is what we're all here for. But I tried to give you my own honest assessment about how I see the situation at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the Q&A section now. If any of you want, please raise your hands virtually. We already have a question ready. And if you feel uncomfortable asking yourself, we can also write it down and we'll ask for you. All right, since Ellie already raised his hand, go ahead.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Gregory, for such an insightful chat. I just want to ask what administrations, both on the Israeli and US side, you think would be most conducive to making significant progress, if not potentially reaching in the next decade, say, a lasting peace? Thanks very much.
Well, the Biden administration has said they want a two-state solution. Obviously, I think that is fraught with difficulties at this stage. The Israeli polity has shifted to the right, not to the left. And I think the only way you're going to get a two-state solution if the Israeli polity begins to shift to the left again, and then you have a more moderate Palestinian leadership in charge. So that has to come about. And the U.S., I'm not sure it has that much influence in making that happen. I wish it could, but I'm not sure that's the case. Emotions right now are very raw in Israel, as far as I know. Even the Israeli left now has many more misgivings about dealing with the Palestinians in light of the October 7 attacks. So there's a lot of obstacles to overcome at this point. I hope things can move in a direction towards peace, but over the short term, I'm just not optimistic, unfortunately.
Yeah, man, Binav.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Benaf from the American University of Kurdistan. So my question regarding to the Palestinian and the Israeli issue is that the last couple of days as well, Iran had a massive missile attack on Kurdish soil and the Kurdistan region of Iraq by claiming that they have attacked the Mossad basis, which was not true. So therefore, my question is that what do you think is the Biden administration foreign policy objective in the region, and how come it can fill out the security vacuum that presents now? And thank you.
Well, I think the Iranian attack near Erbil in northern Iraq, where the Kurdish regional government is, really was not related to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think it was related to the fact that some Iranian Kurdish opponents of the Iranian regime have gotten safe haven in northern Iraq under the Kurdish regional government. And I think Iran was sending a signal there. Let's not forget, just a couple of years ago, Iran was racked by demonstrations over the death of an Iranian Kurdish woman who was not supposedly properly dressed. And that sparked demonstrations all over Iran. But from what I understand, the regime in Iran was very brutal in the Iranian Kurdish areas because they did not want any type of regional dissidents to take advantage, say, of ongoing unrest in Iran. So I think the attack was related to that issue as opposed to the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
Thank you.
All right, Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you. Greetings from Berlin, from Germany. I'd like to address a question regarding the succession of Mahmoud Abbas or Abu Mazen. How do you perceive the preparations from the American side regarding a possible death of Mahmoud Abbas? Because as we all know, the last elections, or since the last elections, time has passed, and there will be necessarily a lack of legitimacy, regardless of whom he will be joined by. Thank you.
Well, Mahmoud Abbas is a very aged leader, and he has lost a lot of legitimacy. So the conventional wisdom is that there has to be new Palestinian leadership coming forward, but nobody knows who would succeed him. And the United States has actually called on the Palestinian Authority to clean up some of the corruption issues that have plagued the Palestinian Authority for some time. So that's an ongoing process. So your answer to the question is, unfortunately, I don't know. Excuse me, there's a family issue that I have to deal with for 1 second. If you don't mind me, I'll be right back. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Sorry. I'll be right back.
Nicholas, that was a very good question.
No, thank you.
Also, in the meantime, if there are people that need to leave on time, because I'm sure the discussion will be going over time a little bit, you guys are always welcome to drop your questions either in the Q&A or... And also, I mean, I have a bunch of questions, so please feel free to like put more than one.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Okay, sorry about that. I had to deal with a family member that was in a different part of the country and things got complicated. Anyway, I'm back. I'd be happy to answer more questions.
Okay, so we have Elizabeth who's been waiting.
Yes, hi. So thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, because you spoke about the inner conflicts within the parties and the upcoming election, with the huge community of American Israeli or American Jewish people in the US. I was wondering if you have noticed a shift in their community's perspective, but also in media rhetoric over the past couple of months during that conflict that could perhaps also impact the upcoming elections in the US?
Well, as I said, prior to October 7, Biden actually inserted himself in the Israeli domestic scene by being very critical of the Netanyahu government for the judicial overhaul plan. But Biden, I think, believed that he was in a safe political space because the majority of the American Jewish community was also critical of the judicial overhaul plan. And, you know, Biden, as a Democrat, has always been much more in tune with the liberal element of the American Jewish community, say, than the more right-wing elements. October 7th and his close embrace of Israel, I think, solidified his standing with the American Jewish community, even among more right-wing elements that were critical of him for various reasons. So I think politically, you know, he's probably has, you know, gotten the support of the majority of the American Jewish community. However, there are, of course, some progressive elements of the American Jewish community, particularly the younger generation, who believe that the Israeli policies in Gaza have been disproportionate. In other words, the Gazan Palestinians have been suffering as a result of the Hamas attacks, and they should not be the people to blame for those Hamas attacks. I suppose that the more progressive and younger, some progressive and younger elements of the American Jewish community would be upset with Biden over not being forceful enough on the Israeli government to maybe limit the casualties in Gaza. But that's my assessment at this particular point.
All right, that doesn't seem like anyone else, so I'm gonna use my power a bit and ask my own question. So you addressed the issue of the United States balancing the relations between Israel and the Arab countries, allies. The thing is, this is something that, from my knowledge, has always been the case. I mean, I've heard an Israeli interpreter frame it that one of Israel's greatest problems in the Middle East is that it's playing a zero-sum game between fear among its enemies and love from its allies in the West. So it was always a game that everything that Israel does to assert its power against its enemies always had a cost on its relationship with its allies, including the United States. So obviously this event is more dramatic than previous events, but why exactly, I mean, why is it that this specifically now, aside from the scale, is that right now we see it's more significant, even though that we actually see that less and less Arab countries care about the Palestinians. And there's some sort of a little more number to it than there used to be in the past.
Well, a couple of things. I think you're right on the overall assessment of what you said. I mean, ever since 1948, when Harry Truman recognized the state of Israel, he was the first world leader to do so. The United States has always had this problem of balancing support with Israel with support in the Arab world, which of course had the oil and strategic interests and things like that. But I think this time around, the scale of Palestinian deaths have surmounted other conflicts. And this is why it has led to a lot of raw emotions within the Arab world. I mean, you're right in a sense that the Abraham Accords process looked like the Arab states were going their own way, establishing relations with Israel without much regard to the Palestinian issue. And I think honestly, that's probably the case prior to October 7. But once the Israelis started to retaliate against Gaza after October 7, and you saw mounting Palestinian civilian casualties, the public sentiment in many of these Arab countries turned to become much more pro-Palestinian again. And this has led to a lot of nervousness within pro-US Arab states. And this is why when Tony Blinken has made the rounds in the Arab world and his many visits to the region, he's gotten an earful saying that in any post-war, one, you have to lean on the Israelis to limit Palestinian casualties, but in any post-war plan, there has to be something leading towards a Palestinian state.
Thank you. Well, Nicholas has another question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a succeeding question, to be precise, regarding the public sentiment in the Arab states. Because you mentioned that it shifted after October 7th, also after Israeli retaliation. But what I was wondering about, to which extent do the Arab states really care about public sentiments? Because if you take, for instance, Bahrain with the protests of 2011 that they shut down, and also in Saudi Arabia or the Arab Emirates, where the public sentiment might not be that pro-Israeli, but nevertheless, so in the case of the Arab Emirates, as far as I know, they didn't end the public and diplomatic relations with Israel. So that would be interesting, to which extent, from your perspective, the Arab states care about public opinion.
Well, there's an ebb and flow, let me put it that way. So in times of calm, one can make the argument that the peoples in the Arab states don't pay much attention to the Palestinian situation. But when things get inflamed, then people do pay a lot of attention. And this is why some states were able to join the Abraham Accords without any substantive policy or concessions the Israelis were making to the Palestinians. Because for a time it seems that there may have been some low-level violence, but things were manageable. But my point is that once things sort of reach a very violent stage, and people see on their television screens the suffering of Palestinians, then I think the dynamic changes. And this is why I think the Saudis are going to be reluctant to join the Abraham Accords unless there's really some substantive movement on an Israeli-Palestinian peace process that could possibly lead to a two-state solution. Even a country like Egypt, which had, which has had many years of peace with Israel. There was a quote by the Egyptian president Sisi when Blinken visited in October, and he said, the Israeli right of self-defense has now turned into a collective punishment policy. And I think maybe Sisi himself may not care that deeply about Palestinians, but certainly public opinion in Egypt has become pro-Palestinian once again as a result of all the problems in Gaza.
Thank you. We have one more question before we'll finish. I know Lydia has plenty.
Yeah, I have a question. It's also kind of connected to the sentiments within the Arab world, but I am mostly wondering as to what exactly the US foreign policy towards regional stability in the Middle East is right now, because since October 7th, there has been also many attacks towards Israel coming from the north, coming from Houthis, coming from different directions. And I am wondering if there is like a overarching strategy or policy, even in these last months of the Biden administration, to address not only the Gaza-Israel war, but the general instability that was triggered by it.
Well, the conventional wisdom in Washington is that the US wants to quote unquote pivot to Asia. But the Middle East keeps bringing the US back into the Middle East, right? So when the Israeli-Hamas war started, the Biden administration did not want this to lead to a wider conflict, and that's for sure. However, you have these pro-Iranian militias in both Syria and Iraq then attacking periodically US positions in both countries, which then compelled the US to strike back. Similarly, in the Red Sea, you have the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which are ideologically strongly opposed to Israel, then trying to attack ships supposedly going to Israel, but in fact, they've been attacking ships just doing normal commercial transit through the Red Sea as a way to go from one point to another. So the Biden administration, was reluctant to get involved, but then over the past week started to attack Houthi sites in Yemen directly in conjunction with the UK. So the Israeli-Palestinian issue has always had this potential to lead to a wider conflict, and the US under Biden was very cognizant of that. They did not want the US to get involved militarily in any way, but sometimes you don't have a choice. As various militia groups hit US targets, the US always feels it has an obligation then to protect its troops, to protect its assets and commercial interests. So reluctantly now you see the US is now engaged in kind of low-level military activity in the Middle East where it really didn't want to be. And that's the situation I see unfolding right now.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Gregory. We're going to make some closing remarks. If you're willing, we can continue the conversation so we can have a few more questions. I know I have a few more.
I'll be happy to stay on.
All right, thank you very much. So thank you all for coming. I know this was very interesting that I have a lot more questions. I'm sure you all had some insight from this. So first, again, thank you all for engaging, for participating. And today's discussion was, again, very interesting. And I know I learned a lot more. So, we hope that you take an insight from here that you can thoroughly apply to your other things, and we can meet you in our next sessions. Now, as you can already see the next sessions scheduled in the shared screen. So stay tuned. You can also follow us on social media to get updates, and I hope to see you soon in the next event.
If nobody has a question, I would actually have a quick follow-up question, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
If we would see a change in administration towards the end of the year in the US, how would that affect like what kind of a difference would that make within the U.S. policy towards the Middle East?
Well, as you know, Trump was very indulgent of Netanyahu when Trump was president. He supported a peace process that was very heavily tilted towards Israel, and something that Netanyahu, in fact, embraced. Netanyahu, when he was running for re-election, even had posters in Israel where he and Trump were, side by side, smiling together. So it showed that he and Trump were very close. Trump actually, however, got a little ticked off at Netanyahu for congratulating Biden after the November 2020 election, where I think Trump believed that that type of phone call should not have been held because Trump, I think, takes things very personally. That's his nature. But Trump, I suspect, would perhaps not be as critical of Netanyahu that Biden is in private. That's my sense. However, on the other hand, Trump does not want to get into a Middle Eastern war. Trump was very critical of the George W. Bush administration for the war in Iraq. And he said he wanted to get out of Syria. He said we should not get involved in Middle Eastern quagmires. So on the one hand, one can expect Trump to be continue to be pro-Netanyahu, I would guess, but at the same time, be very wary of getting involved any more deeply than Biden has on Middle Eastern issues. That's my sense, anyway.
Appreciate it.
I also have a question. I wonder, with the increasing tensions on the largest global scale, as the new axis of China, Russia, Iran, and the Western consolidating alliances, do you think, and again, China also intervening within the Middle East, trying to play more of the negotiator role, do you think has this factored into the Biden's administration consideration of policies in this regard, or is this just something unrelated next to it?
By Middle Eastern role, what are you referring to?
I mean, China has been more actively playing as trying to play as a big power negotiating between different countries in the Middle East.
Okay.
Iran and Saudi, for example.
Right. Certainly, China played a role in the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which certainly boosted China's sort of position in the Middle East. China is still very much a player in the Middle East on the commercial side of things versus the diplomatic side of things. Just putting aside the Iran-Saudi issue. China does not have the same amount of clout as the United States has on the Israeli-Palestinian or the broader Arab-Israeli situation. So I think it's still the United States' ball game to try to broker some type of Israeli-Palestinian peace, much more than any other outside power. And when you look at certain equities, it's only really the United States that has leverage with the Israelis more than any other country. Certainly much more than, say, the EU as a collective at this point.
Would it be all right if I asked one other question, Gregory, if you have the time, please?
Please.
Thank you. How do you think the US should approach dealing with Iran and its proxies?
Well, Iran is playing a kind of a cagey game at this point. They want the U.S. out of the Middle East, but they're afraid of a direct U.S.-Iran military confrontation. They know, even though their military has improved over the past couple of decades, they're still no match for the U.S. military. So they rather use proxies to actually cause trouble and then perhaps force the United States out. I think what's going on here, and this is my opinion, and I could be wrong, but the proxy attacks by pro-Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq against U.S. forces, I think is designed for the U.S. to overreact. And if the U.S. overreacts, then perhaps civilian casualties would mount, and there'll be more calls for the U.S., say, to get out of both Syria and Iraq. In the Red Sea, they're encouraging the Houthis to attack commercial ships, and the U.S. has now responded militarily, and the hope then by Iran is that this would cause anti-American sentiment to grow. So Iran certainly wants the U.S. out, but is very willing to let other people do their dirty work, if you want to call it that, to get to that point. However, I just don't see the U.S. leaving the Middle East anytime soon. So it's a strategy, but it's a strategy that I don't think is going to work.
Yeah, I think maybe if the US were to potentially get involved in democracy building, well, that's a bad phrase to throw around the Middle East, actually, but improving the legitimacy of the institutions in places like Lebanon, because I know a few guys over there and they continuously bring up how Hezbollah has a lock, along with the Amal party who they support, on the presidential system and the parliamentary system, and how that's really, really problematic for the ordinary Lebanese political parties, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, one can make the argument that Hezbollah, in particular, has a stranglehold now on Lebanese politics, and that makes it very difficult for non-Hezbollah parties to kind of refigure the Lebanese political system and have more control over things. I'm not sure there's an easy answer, however, to that problem. Lebanon is a mess, unfortunately, both politically and economically at this point. Hezbollah is a very strong force militarily and politically in Lebanon. So I'm not sure how you're going to change that equation anytime soon. Any other questions or comments?
It seems we're done here. Thank you very much, Barry. This was fascinating, really.
Well, I'm very happy to participate, and I really applaud your organization for delving into very controversial foreign policy issues. I think that's the way we all can learn from each other. So congratulations on what you're trying to do from your end.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much, Gregory.
Thank you.
Have a
Okay.
great day.
Bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Yeah.
Hey, question. You wanted to set a meeting, right?
Me?
Yeah. Since
Yeah.
we're already talking, figured.
Sure. What day works for you?